Oh,
Back in 1950s, Dumbarton Methodist Church underwent a dramatic change in fortunes. It had been a very wealthy church, a large attendance church. But during the 50s, people became concerned about the crime rates in the District of Columbia and had a mass out-migration of white people from the city. The church began losing a lot of its membership and a lot of its clout and a lot of its money. And the developer came to the church and said, you've got a piece of property up there on Rock Creek Park that's been used as a cemetery. And you have a court injunction against you. You cannot bury anybody there anymore because it's so full up and it's just decrepit condition. You can't use the cemetery. So why don't you sell it to me and I'll build some townhouses on it. So Richard McFarland, who was a pastor at the time, a young pastor, didn't want to see his church go under, so he began negotiating with them over the sale of that piece of property. And eventually the developer came back and said, you know, I can make a lot more money if we put townhouses. We didn't put townhouses in there, we put apartment buildings in there, similar to the ones that are already along the avenue bridge. So the nature of the debate began to change a bit. By this time, the congregation of Dumbarton was down to what you could count a handful of people. And they're all young people. Members had moved out. Yeah.
Go ahead and speak, Mike.
And all the younger people, children had moved out to the suburbs for the most part. They had decided to redo the basement of the church to make it more amenable to Sunday school classes for the children. And by the time they got the process done, there were no children left in the congregation to attend Sunday school. So they had this brand new finished basement that they didn't know what to do with. They still needed money. And the furnace began to give out. It was cold. We have pictures of the pastors giving sermons wearing gloves and overcoats. We were hand to mouth, never knowing whether we were going to be open one day to the next. And when the developer came to us with this proposal for developing upscale apartment houses, 5- and 7-story apartment houses, I believe they were, we had quite an interesting discussion. And the discussion originally started around the environment. We were not aware, the young congregation there, not aware that we even had the cemetery, that it belonged to us, or if it did, who was buried there, or what connection it had with this new congregation with the old congregation. But we were aware that we had an 1.5 acres of land on Rock Creek Parkway in Georgetown. And we wanted to preserve, some of us wanted to preserve that property, this natural land. Part of the cemetery had been given away to the Park Service several years earlier when they built a bicycle lane along the Rock Creek Parkway. And they were using that as an example of how you could turn the property into usable parkland property without too much difficulty. Excuse me, my mind wanders every once in a while. I was going to say the initial impetus for protecting that land was environmental issues. But in order to try to convince people of the need for the environmental preservation of the land, we decided there ought to be some history of what it was, who's buried there, how they got to be buried there, and what the place ought to look like, because it was a mess. You could walk through there and find pieces of ladies' shoes coming up out of the ground, and find pieces of bones sticking up out of the ground of many of the burial plots. And many of the tombstones turned out to be made out of wood. They're simply carved to look like concrete tombstones and painted with gray paint to look like authentic tombstones. They were for the so-called midnight burials. People would just come in and bury somebody there without paying space. You know, we had no accurate record of how many people were actually buried there, who they were, and where they were. And it was all tremendously overgrown. And the first thing the congregation decided how to do was at least clean up the place so we could see what it looked like. And for several weeks on end, members of the Dumbarton congregation went up to the Mount Zion Cemetery and chopped and hacked and cut away and cleared out the place. Eventually, we were joined by members of Mount Zion Church. It became a meeting ground for members of Dumbarton and Mount Zion who hadn't talked to each other in years. We can say that the creation of a joint congregation between Mount Zion and Dumbarton Church had its genesis in this burial ground at Mount Zion Cemetery. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. One of the things that we did try to do was preserve the tombstones. I remember one day I was personally walking in the cemetery to do some work, and I saw a man pull up a pickup truck with Virginia license tags on the truck, walk into the cemetery, come and pick up a bunch of tombstones and start carrying the tombstones out and putting them in the back of his pickup truck. And I asked him what in the world he was doing with his private property. His response was, well, I'm building a dock down in the lake in Virginia, and I need these stones for the foundation for my dock. So I got in touch with Vincent DeForest, who's the head of the African American Foundation, Afro-American Bicentennial Commission, and he got in touch with the DC Police Department. They sent someone over to stop the gentleman from removing a tombstone. They realized then that we had to do something to protect the tombstones. We tried to please the Park Service to agree to protect what land was there. They refused to do it because of the tombstones. They said the tombstones, we don't take any property, we have to mow around. So we got the brilliant idea of taking up all the tombstones and putting them in one huge pile in the center of the cemetery and covering it over with wild brambles and things that would discourage people from stealing the tombstones. At the same time, we tried to do a census, a paper census of who each tombstone was. But that was very chaotic because they've been moved and battered around a great deal over the years. Again, we had no idea how many people were buried there or who, and very little idea of the history of the cemetery. One interesting aspect that has been overlooked recently, I think, is that at the very top, at the entrance to the cemetery, there's a large vault of some type. We did echo sounding of it, and clearly not a tomb. It's not a tomb, but it's a vault. And we found some historical records that claim that this is the burial place for Hessian soldiers who been hired by the British to march on Washington in the War of 1812. I hope that someday we'll be able to look into the history of that, find out whether it's actually true or not. The British claim that they didn't have any Hessians here. And yet our historians say there were. It's a good example of where we can look it up. Dumbarton realized very early on that they did not have the resources to clean the cemetery up, to take care of it properly. We tried to find a way to, excuse me.
Can I have you now?
We're on the air.
Huh?
I'm on the air.
Oh, okay. Well, later on, okay? I'll come back later on.
Joys of living in assisted living facilities in Riderwood. I'm sorry it takes so long. We began to do some historical research. And Vincent DeForest was particularly interested in that little shack, the holding vault down this inside of the cemetery. And he was convinced that that had been used during the trek north by Southern slaves taking way into Maryland, the freedom of Maryland. And eventually he was able to find some documentation out in the Midwest somewhere of some people who claimed to have gone through that process. And so we were able to begin to tracing down and finding out that that actually was, rather than just an interesting story that somebody made up to try to sell the cemetery. There's some accuracy to the story, and that's where the pick up the wonderful play that you're doing now for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We will now screen share again, perhaps.
I'm afraid to at this point. All right, let's try it a minute and see if I can figure out the right screen to give you. Did we manage at that time?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, so what I wanted to show you, in the many conversations I've had with Mike about the cemetery over the years, the way he always starts is by saying there were really two cemeteries, and there were really two plots of land involved. Let's put it that way. When you look at document records and land records, and this larger piece is the Female Union Band Society piece. And then this smaller piece was acquired in 1822 at that point by the Methodist, now I'm going to blank on the names. That's why I had all my notes up so I could keep track of the names.
Montgomery Street Church.
Thank you. And one of the things I wanted to explain is that as we know of the complicated history between the two churches, was also an extremely complicated history between the two pieces of land because they were two distinct pieces of land. And what happened was that over the course of more than a century, Dumbarton tried to keep putting the land back in Mount Zion's hands. But because of the complexities of doing that, which were complicated by the fact that the church changed names 4 or 5 times from Montgomery Street Methodist Church to Dumbarton Methodist Episcopal to Dumbarton United Methodist, that there were a lot of disconnects between all the different records that needed to be pulled together to try to make that transfer of property. So beginning in 1879, there was a 99-year lease to Mount Zion of this piece of the land. And because of some in the congregation disagreeing with that move, when Oak Hill Cemetery opened, there were some family members who moved bodies to the new cemetery. But there were attempts again in the late 50s. And then in the time period that Mike was talking about in the early 70s, as it came to the time for the lease to expire, there were some further efforts to try to transfer the land, but there have been issues, points in time when the DC Historical Society records weren't available because of renovations and all sorts of things. So you probably have, several generations of boards of trustees that tried to make this happen. But we finally managed to accomplish it in 2017. And were able to transfer all right, title and interest in the cemetery to Mount Zion so that now they're able to try to get support and develop the two pieces, develop in the sense of just improving and renovating in a more cohesive way. So I just wanted to provide that. I could talk forever on this, but I really want us to hear Susan. So thank you.
Thank you. So we'll stop screen share, and we will ask Susan to be talking about the artistic interpretation of the history of these cemeteries.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Connie. She's one of the supporters of this Alliance for New Music Theater New Work. And there's Joe Friebel, his wife, who've also supported us. And in this room, there's Stuart of Stuart and Leah, and they've supported us. And of course, Elaine and Rob, who couldn't have done any of this without, who have I forgotten? Oh, Joe Aldridge. And you, yes, of course. Well, we have a whole group of people who are supporting us by being part of the Dumbarton Choir. And just before I forget to say anything, launch into the whole story of putting this together, one of the pieces that you should know about is, of course, the looking through your windows.
Somehow Susan just got muted.
Here, sorry. Okay, sorry.
Okay, I was just saying that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I was just saying that the looking through your windows, which is the piece that opens Act 2 and the Dumbarton Choir, has valiantly worked through tirelessly to understand, because it's a complicated piece of music, as is all the music that Ronald Trey composes. This is your 250th anniversary birthday gift. So we hope you will find times to bring it back and get more and more people to learn it. In terms of the work itself, I stumbled on the cemetery, literally stumbling over some of the stones when I was walking my dog, which I understand is quite the no-no in the cemeteries frowned upon, but many do it, as did I, because I didn't know it was a cemetery. And I first met Patrick Tisdale, who is, I think, an unproclaimed saint of Georgetown, and certainly the cemeteries in terms of his volunteer work, helping restore, preserve, etc., the stones, the headstones. And then I met, of course, Lisa Fager, the executive director of these two cemeteries, which have been put together as a nonprofit memorial park. And I think UNESCO has claimed this now as a sacred site. So there is more, that was in 2019, I believe. So there has been interest in this, growing interest in finding it. And Mike, thank you for mentioning the Hessians, because I actually saw the stone. It's huge. It's almost as large as one of your big tables here. And it's a stone that commemorates the Hessian soldiers that indeed have been buried there. The other thing I've heard but not confirmed is that the original Ark, which was the meeting place by Mount Zion when it first split from your church, the congregation of 125 people demanded to have their own church and were allowed to do so after probably some negotiations. And where what used to be, as of 2 days ago, was a 7-Eleven on P Street in 27, was in fact the site of that original Ark. And there was, they believe, a tunnel that was part of the Underground Railroad that went to the vault. So the vault, if you can imagine, all, as they say in the show, the dead and decaying bodies, that is where the enslaved attempts, they would stay there and food would be left there by these women, and they would go and the enslaved would attempt their escape in the Rock Creek that was at the bottom of the hill, which was then navigable. So there is that history that is, I think, such an important part of your history as well. I got interested in, of course, all of the stories, and some of the spirits, I swear, called to me. And Lisa also called me many times and said, we need to do something, and we need to do something as part of DC Emancipation Day. So this was going to open April 16th. And it did not open only because the mayor decided instead to have a hip hop parade and a fireworks that night, 3 days before, and told an office about that. But so it's a complicated history in all ways, but we hope to be able to do this at the Ark because there are so many African Americans who know nothing about these cemeteries, or indeed so many other cemeteries. Two of the characters in our show, Alfred and Hannah Pope, were in fact buried elsewhere in Harmony cemeteries because it was too crowded by this point. There was no room at the inn, so to speak. And despite there were also, as Mike mentioned, midnight burials. We focus on a few people and on a few stories that I think are related to that cemeteries, because Alfred and Hannah Pope, while they were buried elsewhere, their 3 eldest children were buried in these cemeteries. And Alfred was quite the leader at Mount Zion. He was too young to have been in your church, but his uncle attended your church, as I understand it, and was part of he was a congressman sent from South Carolina. So again, what is interesting when I say it's his uncle, so Alfred Pope, whose house still stands at 29th and O, he was born in South Carolina. His father was his master, and he looks exactly like Carter. And our Alfred Pope looks exactly, that is to say, the actor looks amazingly like Alfred Pope. And I understand he is a Washingtonian, and his ancestors could have been. He doesn't know that, of course, because so many of his history has been lost. But Alfred Pope, after he was manumitted, which was upon the death of his uncle, so he was sent up. Sorry, I missed the part. So he was sent up here because the wife of his master in South Carolina thought it was a little bit, they had too many similarities, and it was awkward, to say the least. And so she sent him up here, where he was enslaved by his uncle, Congressman Carter. And what I found very interesting about my dig into this history is that it's so much more complicated than what we understand are the relationships between Blacks and whites in what we are usually taught in schools in some small, subchapter of a subchapter. It was like Gone with the Wind plantation slaves. The slaves in DC lived enslaved in DC, worked side by side with many free, and by 1830, there was 40% of Georgetown was African American, and many of those were free. And so this community kept building and building, and also the relationships between the enslaved and their masters was quite, I would say, complicated. You may have heard that the City Tavern, the owner of the then Georgetown Hotel, was white and was completely illiterate. Her manager was enslaved and did all of the books and could read, and so when the churches began to proliferate, this emphasis on education, this emphasis on literacy continued. And so side by side, you would have wonderful relationships between enslaved and people who were free and then would turn around and free others. So it's interesting. And as Alfred says, he worked side by side, and his master, Congressman Carter, just couldn't understand why he would want to escape, because they lived together and they worked together and they went to church together. What was the problem, you know? So again, this brings me to what I really want to have you guys converse with, those of you who've seen the show, is one of our characters sings, "How many times till we get it right?" And I keep thinking, we tried with the cemeteries, we tried to move the stones to save them, only to find out we now have no map of who was where, you know. We try, and I say we try to do all of these things. Now we're in various conversations. Your church and Mount Zion have been for years, trying to do reckoning and reconciliation. But are we getting it right? And what does right mean? And what's the next right thing to do? This is what intrigues me about this show as a catalyst. It's not about, I mean, yes, let's claim our history. We need to do that. But then how does that change us? And I'd love to hear from you about that. How many times till we get it right?
Okay, so comments first from people who are in person, and those who are coming to us by Zoom. If you will either put your name into chat or what your comments are. If you put your name into chat, then Roger will be calling on you, or you can put in your remarks. Remember, we are recording, and thank you for being part of Dumbarton history that is living today. First comment from a group member.
Hi, I'm Rob McDougall, and I don't think the recording captured your identity, Mike Beard, as the historian of Dumbarton Church, and I just wanted to make that part of the recording because you were introduced before the recording started. But I wanted to ask you, how did you manage to persuade this small group of young Dumbartonians who didn't have the means to even keep the furnace running, to try to keep the cemeteries out of the hands of developers and to stop the sale that would have put Dumbarton in a much more comfortable position financially for probably the next generation or so. How did you persuade the rest of the congregation that this was the right thing to do?
Mike, how did you persuade the congregation to do the right thing? Oops, if you are muted at the moment. So you can just put your finger on the space bar if you want. There you go.
I have no idea how it happened. It's a matter of progress, but I would add that one of the most important things that happened to us was the involvement of Vincent DeForest of the Afro-American Bicentennial Commission, an outside group that's read the story of what we were trying to do at the cemetery, and got involved and got the Park Service involved and got several high schools involved and got a lot of information available. But it was just a matter of several years of arguing that people buried there were a lot more important than preserving a particular building or a particular congregation. It was a difficult time for us. We had a hard time making that decision because we desperately needed the money. But we succeeded in transferring it from a conversation about trees to what you are doing now is talking about the real people who were there and what they symbolized to our history of the city of Washington. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mike. Other comments from first people who are here in person?
Well, I recently saw an interview with a professor. I don't remember his name or his school, but he was explaining the present political polarization of the United States as a result, a reaction to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which is what I've always thought. And the discussion of how many times do we take before we get it right, we got it right when slavery was abolished, and that was followed by 100 years of right-wing backlash. And then we got it right again with the civil rights movement, and that was followed by 50 years of slowly creating what we have now, which is a right-wing Supreme Court and a right-wing political movement, which is basically half the country. So there's two questions. How do we get it right, and how do we stop the backlash?
Really good question. Maybe somebody wants to follow up on that. But. Stu?
Right.
Here, this one.
Right.
Thank you. Susan, I'm going to build on what we just heard to talk about the impact I think your presentation of the Songs of Zion is having. I enjoyed the show very much. Go back a little bit. When I first came to Dumbarton, close to 50 years ago, we had a very energetic pastor, Eric Kiley, very powerful preacher. And of course, we have the history of our balcony being of blacks being African Americans being consigned to the balcony. Well, I kind of couldn't believe it when I came and so forth, but I didn't think much of it because, okay, that's gone, that's behind. Then stories started coming out how as recently as early in Harry Kiley's ministry here, one of the Dumbarton ushers, an African-American man, came to worship with us, and the usher put him in the balcony. And the story is, Mike, maybe you were here, that Harry Kiley came charging down the middle aisle there, fired the usher on the spot, went up to the balcony, and came down with the African-American gentleman. So that happened a few years before I actually was part of the congregation, but it's bothered me. I mean, it's so outrageous that it gives me shivers when I think about it. And in your performance, the leader of the African-American congregation, at a certain point, he's right in the middle of our horseshoe, and he's all alone in that area. And he very angrily says, "No, damn it, I'm not going to go up and sit in that balcony. You can take that balcony, get rid of it." And for me, that was one step in the direction of closure for me, because I found myself saying, "Yeah, right on, way to go." So I think that closure for me has been incremental, still going on. This morning before you started, I was down at Mount Zion meeting with some people there about their Feed the Unhoused program. So I think we have more ground to cover, but I would argue that incremental steps are very important. And your production is indeed a very important incremental step. So thank you.
We're going to have our questions and comments be short so that we can try to get everybody in. Thank you.
I just want to do a quick follow-up on what Stuart's saying, because I think one of the things we're struggling with is not having Mount Zion educate us. You know, we keep trying to educate ourselves because Black folks are tired of educating the whites. And I agree with Stuart that this was one way to say, yes, we acknowledge that. We were really bad people.
I'm Greg Tillman, and I attended the play last night, and I was expecting to learn and gain insight on issues of race, thinking about the history of the cemetery of Mount Zion and Dumbarton. What I wasn't really ready for was this powerful feeling about the role of women, powerful women, women who had no right to vote at the time, who had no claim on equality with regard to men, whether they were white or African American. And yet, this movement and so much of what was accomplished was sustained by these powerful women. It was really striking.
Can I just respond to that? And then I'll get you in. Yes, that was one of the most exciting parts for me to discover, was that these women at a time when white or Black women could not own and buy land, they not only bought land, found a way around it, but then not only were able to meet as a sewing circle when gatherings of African Americans during various times was not allowed. There were DC ordinances against it, but they were able to sew. And so under the guise of sewing, they not only clothed people who were trying to run away, clothed their own people when they needed help, whether it was a sick child or burying a child. Of course, child mortality was so high. But then, of course, with the Underground Railroad, this is what they were doing. It was dangerous work, and it was all women.
Okay, we have time for one more comment here in person, and then we'll go to chat.
On the question of who got it right at one particular juncture, when the issue of how to dispose of that property, the possibility of selling it and building, Mike Beard was at the center of that controversy. There was a lot of opposition in the church, and he single-handedly persuaded us, and I was one of those that had to be persuaded not to sell. Thanks, Mike.
Yes, thank you, Mike. A final comment or question from Joe on Zoom.
Thank you. I have two comments. One, just to follow on that kudo to Mike. In Many Witnesses, it talks about how in 1972, our church had a quarterly conference to decide whether or not to sell. And Mike and Melinda were adamant that the church should not sell. The congregation was split on the issue, and as a result, and this is in the book, Mike and Melinda were shunned by the congregation until finally the whole, more of the congregation came around to the idea that should not be sold. But so they paid a direct personal price for that. The other thing, Stuart was right that an usher sent one of the Black men, refused to seat him and that was 1961 when Edison Amos was the pastor. Also in that period, Dumbarton had a supper for military men, and when the military men arrived, there was a table for Black men and there was a table for white men downstairs. And I think the final nail in the coffin was when the district superintendent at the time came to attend the service, and one of the ushers said, "Oh, no, you can't sit down here because you're Black." This was the district superintendent, Edward Carroll, and he was directed to the balcony. And I think that was the case where the usher was fired on the spot, and the DS was brought back down to assume his place in the main sanctuary. So it's a checkered past, to be sure.
Okay, Joe's comment is a good place for us to end, noting that if you look at history, you're going to find all kinds of things. And this, I think, is perhaps going to be one in a series of programs we may have to dig even deeper, if you don't mind me saying that about the story of the cemeteries. Sorry, guys. I do want, before we thank our speakers today, I want to let you know that next week we have a special final program for the season. We will not be having adult education in the summer. We are going to be back in the art realm, art and ecology, and our presenter is going to be a fine young man by the name of Billy Freeble. So please, I hope everybody comes to that. Let us join together to thank our three speakers by raising our hands in applause if you can, or waving them around. Mike, Connie, and Susan. Thank you all very much. Know this is recorded. You can check back and hear parts of those stories again and recommend it to other people. We'll hope that you do so. Thank you, and we hope to see you at worship service soon.
Thank you. Thank you.